Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the dim kitchens and smoky halls of the medieval world, where the clink of wooden spoons and the low crackle of the hearth fill the background. The air smells faintly of yeast, herbs, and something, vaguely questionable. You're sitting at a heavy oak table, hunched in a fur-lined robe that smells of last night's rain. In front of you, a clay mug of wine. Not just for toasting or feasting, but for breakfast. Yes, before the rooster's even done his job, you're sipping fermented grape juice and being told it's for your health. You probably won't survive this, but at least you'll do it with a smug medieval sense of self-care. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The mug is warm from being near the fire all night, though the wine inside is a thin, watered-down version of what you might expect at a modern dinner table. Your host swears this will purify your blood, a phrase they say with such conviction you almost believe it. The reasoning: wine was thought to balance the humorous those for mysterious fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, that was supposedly the foundation of all health. A splash of wine in the morning, especially if mixed with a bit of water to cool its heat, was believed to chase away melancholy and even help digestion. The truth is, clean drinking water was a gamble in many places, so fermented drinks were a safer bet, though your morning might end up more cheerful than productive. Historians still argue whether this habit was purely medicinal or just a socially acceptable way of starting the day with a buzz. Either way, you're sipping like a noble. But this isn't a rich man's exclusive. In the villages, peasants might get a mug of small ale or thin wine in the morning, sometimes with a piece of bread dunked in for substance. And it wasn't just the drink itself. People would drop spices into their breakfast wine, believing cinnamon could warm the body in winter and cloves could keep away disease. Imagine dropping cinnamon sticks in your morning cabernet and calling it medicine. There's also the curious idea of wine as a mood manager. Too much, and it was thought to make you sluggish. Too little, and you risked becoming too cold and melancholic. So your breakfast cup was meant to hit that sweet spot, just enough to put a glow in your cheeks without making you stumble into the pig's trough. Of course, the reality wasn't always glamorous. A tavern's morning wine might be sour, flecked with bits of cork or worse, and served in a cup that had been rinsed only in yesterday's rainwater. But medieval you isn't complaining. You're here for your health, and the ritual feels good. The clatter of wooden trenchers being set down, the chatter of servants arranging dried figs or cheese beside your cup, the smell of hearth smoke rising with the morning light. You take another sip, telling yourself you can feel your humors balancing already, even though you suspect it's just the heat from the fire and the alcohol's early nudge. One traveling physician you once met swore by adding crushed rosemary to morning wine as a way to keep evil vapors from clouding the brain. Another insisted a drop of honey would glue the spirits together and give you sharper wit. You try it once, but the result tastes like someone made tea out of an herb garden and poured it into grape juice. Still, you nod along like a good patient, and if you were wealthy, breakfast wine might be served in a cup made of pewter or even silver, under the belief that the metal itself could purify what you drank. The servants would pour it slowly, letting you admire the way the morning light hit the liquid, making it glow ruby red. It was as much a performance as it was a meal. Of course, breakfast wine was also a social signal. Having wine at all meant you had the means to store and protect it, not to mention access to grapes or trade routes. It was one of those quiet status markers. You might not be wearing a crown, but the neighbors know you drink wine before the church bells ring. Still, there were whispers. Some monks wrote sermons warning against the devil's temptations in the morning cup, claiming that starting the day with wine dulled the soul. Others countered that God himself gave the vine, so why not start with his blessing? And so, the debate continued, with pious drinkers happily quoting scripture to justify their morning habit. You finish your cup as the hall grows brighter, the first real warmth of the sun creeping across the table. Your lips feel warm, your fingers a little lighter. Outside, the day waits markets to visit, gossip to gather, maybe even a hunt. But you've already begun the day in what your world believes is the healthiest possible way, with a good dose of grape-based medicine, taken right after you wake. And yes, you're already wondering what they'll pour at dinner. You don't get far before someone insists you need something to fortify your vital heat. That's how you end up staring down a wooden bowl of raw egg and honey, thick, golden, and clinging stubbornly to the sides. It wobbles slightly as you lift it, almost daring you to take the plunge. The recipe is simple enough. Crack a fresh egg, stir it into honey until the yolk disappears, and gulp it down before it has time to think about becoming anything solid. It's cold, sticky, and smells faintly of the straw from the chicken coop. In your modern brain, alarms are going off about salmonella, but medieval you doesn't have that word. You only have the belief, repeated by every herbalist and market vendor, that this concoction will stoke your internal fire and keep you from catching chills in the damp season. It's not entirely superstition. Eggs were seen as concentrated life in a shell, and honey was thought to be both a divine gift and a natural preservative, able to keep bad humors at bay. Together, they were believed to feed the spirit and help your body recover from fatigue or illness. The texture, however, is not what the poets sing about. You take a sip thick and velvety at first. Then, oddly slickened, you swear it clings to your throat like it has ambitions of living there rent-free. For nobles, the honey would be the finest imported perhaps, or gathered from carefully kept hives scented with lavender or thyme. Peasants might get a coarser mix, the honey crystallized in spots, the egg from a hen that had been strutting around the dung heap that morning. Still, both rich and poor believed in its power. Sometimes this egg-honey mixture was prescribed to new mothers to restore strength, or to elderly folk to rekindle the dwindling flame. In some medical manuscripts, it's listed alongside more exotic tonics like powdered pearls in wine or milk boiled with saffron. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed these worked or if the tradition survived because it was simply easy and cheap to prepare. One fringe belief claimed that taking raw egg and honey before sunrise would make your voice sweeter. For the day handy if you were a bard, a town crier, or someone trying to impress at court. You imagine yourself bursting into the marketplace with a perfectly smooth tone, only to realize your teeth are still glued together by leftover honey. And then there's the seasonal superstition. In some parts of Europe, people swore that eating this mixture on the first day of spring would protect you from coughs for the rest of the year. You can picture the entire households lined up at dawn, eyes bleary, forcing down their spoonfuls while muttering prayers for health. If you're traveling, you might find variations. Some add a splash of wine to thin the mixture. Others whip it into a froth for a lighter texture. One particularly confident apothecary even stirs in powdered cinnamon, claiming it drives away the creeping cold in the lungs. The result tastes like you're drinking a bakery, but it's still raw egg underneath. This concoction also makes its way into certain morning-after remedies. You saith medieval hangovers existed, though nobody called them that. The logic was that raw egg would coat the stomach, while honey would mend the humours upset by too much wine. Whether it actually worked or just gave people something else to focus on is anyone's guess. There's a quiet ritual to it. The egg is cracked carefully, the honey spooned with slow precision, the two folded together until they gleam like liquid gold. The bowl feels warm in your hands, the air carrying the faint hum of bees from the nearby hives. You're aware, faintly, of the chickens clucking outside, their feathers rustling as they peck at the frozen ground. Everything about it feels fresh and alive if you can forget the idea that it's still technically raw. As you finish, your lips sticky, you're told the most confident of promises. This will keep you strong all winter. You're skeptical, but you admit the sugar rush is immediate. Your fingers feel warmer, your steps quicken, and whether it's real or just the placebo effect, you can't help but think the medieval world is starting to win you over with its strange breakfast science. Still, you make a mental note. Maybe stick to one bowl a day. You've seen the chicken coops. You've seen where the eggs come from. And while medieval medicine swears by vital heat, you suspect too much of this stuff might just keep you glued to the nearest garderobe. The morning stretches on, the market square humming with merchants calling out their wares, and you find yourself drawn to a stall tucked between a cooper's workshop and a tanner's stinking shed. Here, a cheerful woman in a linen cap is ladling something quivering and translucent into a shallow wooden dish. She calls it jellied eel, and she swears it will keep your joints supple and your humours balanced, especially during damp, bone-chilling weather. The sight is memorable. Pale, glistening chunks of eel are suspended in a shimmering gel, like someone trapped tiny sea serpents inside a window pane of wobbling glass. The vendor plops a slice onto a piece of coarse bread, the gelatin swaying gently as you hold it. It smells faintly briny, with a whiff of onion and peppercorn. Eel wasn't a fringe ingredient in the Middle Ages. It was a respected part of the diet, especially for those living near rivers. Its reputation wasn't just culinary. Eels were believed to be moist in the humorist sense, meaning they could counteract excessive dryness in the body. That's why eel jelly was praised as a winter food. It supposedly lubricated the joints and eased stiffness brought on by cold. Historians still argue whether the jelly's actual nutrients were valued, or whether its slippery texture simply fit neatly into the logic of the humours. The process is as painstaking as it is unappetizing to modern eyes. First, the eels are cleaned and boiled with herbs, vinegar, and sometimes a splash of wine. Then, the broth is left to cool until it naturally sets into a jelly thanks to the collagen released from the eel's skin and bones. The richer households might flavour it with cloves, mace, or saffron, while peasants were lucky to get a dash of parsley. You bite in, and the jelly melts instantly, leaving behind a rich, oily flavour that's surprisingly pleasant once you get past the texture. The bread underneath has absorbed some of the eel's juices, making it soft but not soggy. You can almost imagine it warming your belly, easing the stiffness in your fingers, chasing away that chill that creeps in during long winter. Mornings, there's a quirky superstition surrounding eel jelly. Some people claimed it could protect you from rheumatism if eaten on the first frost of the year. Others took it further. saying eel jelly was a love charm. Eat it before visiting your beloved, and your joints won't creak when you kneel. Practical and romantic in its own strange way, in monastic communities, eel dishes were common during fasting days, since fish was allowed when meat was forbidden. Eel jelly, in particular, was a way to make a simple ingredient feel more substantial. Monks would sometimes store it in ceramic pots lined with rosemary to keep it fresh. Imagine opening one of those pots weeks later, the scent of rosemary cutting through the brine as you pry out a shimmering cold slab. Not all opinions were glowing. Some healers warned that eel was too cooling if eaten in excess, claiming it could dampen a man's vigor or make a woman sluggish of thought. But for the aching knees of a farmer or the sore wrists of a weaver, eel jelly was medicine you could chew at feasts. Eel jelly could even become a showpiece. Picture a long trestle table lit by flickering candles, platters of glistening eels set between trenchers of roast pork and steaming pies. The jelly would be molded into shapes: fish, flowers, or heraldic crests, turning what was essentially boiled eel broth into edible art. You can't help but grin at the idea of biting into your lord's family crest, only to have it dissolve into fishy slime. One particularly fringe recipe you overhear involves mixing eel jelly with crushed almonds and rose water to make a noble's paste, allegedly good for strengthening the back. You're not sure whether that means posture or something more private, but given medieval medicine's habit of applying one food to 10 unrelated ailments, it's probably both. You finish your portion, wiping a smear of jelly from your fingers, and thank the vendor. She gives you a knowing nod, as if she's just handed you the secret to a long and pain-free life. And maybe, in a world where winter can grind a body down to its bones, a little slippery eel magic is worth believing in. Texture be damned. You wander deeper into the town, your breath clouding in the cold air, when a smell finds you ripe, pungent, and strangely inviting. It leads you to a low, timber-framed shop with bundles of drying herbs hanging from the beams. Inside, an apothecary in a patched wool gown is fussing over a wheel of cheese so large it could double as a table. He slices into it, and the scent blooms earthy, sharp, with a whisper of something medicinal. This isn't just food. Oh no. This is medicinal cheese, and it's apparently as much a prescription as it is a snack. The apothecary explains in a slow, serious tone that certain cheeses, when aged with the right herbs, can heal the stomach, quicken the blood, and sweeten the breath. You glance at the wedge he's offering and silently debate whether that last claim is accurate. The wheel before you is a hard-aged cheese, its rind dusted with crushed sage and rosemary. Some varieties were rubbed with vinegar during aging, others soaked in wine. In wealthier circles, moldy blue cheese was prized. Not avoided, it was thought that the veins of mold contained cleansing vapors that could purge illness. Historians still argue whether people truly appreciated the flavor, or simply believed the mold's odd appearance meant it was doing something medicinal. He cuts you a slice, the herbs sticking to your fingertips, and you take a bite. The cheese is crumbly and dry at first, but then it blooms into something complex, salty, tangy, with a bitter echo from the herbs. It feels almost alive in your mouth. You can't help but imagine this might actually help digestion, if only by scaring your stomach into cooperating. Cheese had a complicated role in medieval diets. Too much of it was believed to clog the body's passages and cause melancholy. Too little, and you risked weakness. The right cheese, however aged with proper care and herbal knowledge, was considered a tonic. Some medical texts even recommend soft cheese for gentle stomachs and hard cheese for firming the bowels. You find yourself grateful for the lack of polite euphemisms in this era. One quirky belief was that eating cheese made from the milk of a newly calved cow could bind the body's strength for the coming year. Another insisted that cheese from an evening milking was cooler and therefore better for hot-tempered people. The apothecary even has a small parchment pinned to the wall listing which herbs should be paired with which ailments: for cough, sage; for melancholy, fennel; for poor eyesight. You half expect him to hand you a cheese wedge labeled like a bottle of pills. Among the wealthy, medicinal cheese sometimes came wrapped in wax, stamped with a family crest. At feasts, it might be served between courses as a stomach settler, eaten slowly with slices of apple or pear. Monks, who were both cheesemakers and amateur physicians, often experimented with adding exotic spices, nutmeg, cloves, even saffron, creating cheeses that blurred the line between food and pharmacy. In rural villages, the practice was simpler. A farmer's wife might tuck sprigs of thyme or lavender into the cheesecloth during aging, believing the herbs would breathe their virtue into the cheese. If a neighbor fell ill, she might cut them a thick slice, wrap it in linen, and send it over with the solemn assurance it would bring recovery. Of course, there were warnings. Some physicians wrote sternly that cheese aged too long could rot the humors and bring on nightmares. Others claimed certain molds caused wind in the head, and yes, possibly in other areas too. But even with these warnings, medicinal cheese remained a steady presence on medieval tables. You watch as the apothecary wraps a small wedge for you in a scrap of parchment. His final advice is to eat it slowly, with a bit of bread, perhaps a sip of wine. The combination, he insists, will strengthen the core and gladden the heart. You tuck it into your satchel, unsure whether you've just bought lunch or a doctor's prescription. Maybe both. In the Middle Ages, that line is deliciously blurry. By the time you reach the edge of the market, the air is colder, the ground underfoot slick with frost, and you find yourself drawn to the smell of something thick and metallic, bubbling away in a blackened pot. A stout woman in a red wool cloak stirs it with a wooden paddle, steam rising in pale ribbons. She smiles, ladles some into a small bowl, and tells you it's pig's blood porridge. You blink. She nods encouragingly. The porridge is a deep reddish brown, flecked with oats and bits of onion, and it has a faint sheen that makes you think of fresh iron. In medieval thinking, this is not alarming, it's healing. Pig's blood was believed to restore strength after illness, replenish the life force lost during fevers, and, in some cases, quite literally replace blood lost from injury. Eating it was like borrowing vitality from the animal itself, and the oats, while oats were seen as grounding, affirming food for the stomach. Together, this rich, hearty porridge was considered a full-bodied tonic, especially in the colder months when fresh vegetables were scarce and meat had to be preserved. In every possible way, historians still argue whether the supposed benefits were based on observed recovery rates or purely on symbolic logic. After all, red liquid going in must mean red liquid being replenished. The recipe is simple in concept, but demanding in execution. The blood has to be stirred constantly while it cooks, or it will clot into appetizing lumps. Vinegar or wine is often added to prevent this, and herbs like marjoram, sage, or pepper are tossed in to mask the strong flavor. For wealthier households, the porridge might also be enriched with butter or milk, creating a silkier texture. You take a cautious spoonful. It's warm and hearty, with an earthy, almost sweet note from the onions. The metallic temps is there, yes, but softened by the oats. You can see why someone recovering from a harsh winter illness might welcome this. It's filling and undeniably caloried. Some healers even prescribe pig's blood porridge to women after childbirth, under the belief that it would restore the blood lost in labor and protect against weakness. Others recommended it for elderly folk who had thin humors and needed fortifying. There's also a curious superstition in certain villages, eating pig's blood porridge on the first full moon of the year was said to protect against nosebleeds for the next 12 months. Not everyone was convinced, of course. A few physicians warned that pig's blood was too heating for certain temperaments, potentially leading to fevers or headaches. Monks, especially those of stricter orders, sometimes frowned on it as unnecessarily indulgent during fasts. But in times when meat was precious and waste was unthinkable, turning every part of the animal into nourishment was both economical and, in the medieval view, medicinal. There were even feast day versions, blood thickened with barley instead of oats, seasoned heavily with imported pepper, served in ceramic bowls painted with saints' faces. These would be eaten after long religious processions, the warmth seeping back into your chilled fingers and toes as you crouched by the fire. One particularly quirky tidbit you overhear: some folk believed that if you ate pig's blood porridge while standing in the doorway of your home, you would guard your household against blood theft. A vague but ominous concept, involving spirits stealing your vitality. Whether anyone truly believed this, or just liked eating near the door for the cool breeze, is anyone's guess. As you finish your portion, the woman tells you that her mother swore by this dish after every winter fever, and that she herself hasn't been laid low in years. You thank her, feeling the porridge sit heavy and warm in your belly, and realize that in a world without iron supplements, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of circulation, this thick, steaming bowl probably felt like the closest thing to bottled health. Your steps take you down a narrower lane now, where the air smells faintly of damp stone and something sharp, almost medicinal. At the end of it, under the shade of a crooked signboard, you find a merchant with glass bottles lined up like jewels on a shelf. The liquid inside is dark and brown-black, and when he unstoppers one, the scent leaps out bitter, earthy, with a hint of something sweetly rotten. He grins, pours a splash into a tiny ceramic cup, and announces it's pickled walnut tonic. The walnuts are green when picked, soft enough to slice through with a knife. They're steeped whole husk, shell, and all in vinegar, salt, and sometimes wine, until they turn almost black. Over the weeks, their bitter bite softens into something rich and complex. Then the liquid is strained off, bottled, and treated like medicine. You're told to sip it slowly in the morning, not unlike your breakfast wine earlier, because it's said to keep evil airs from lodging in the lungs. In medieval thinking, evil airs meant more than just bad smells. They were believed to carry sickness itself. Vinegar was already thought to be a cleanser, and walnuts were praised for their resemblance to the human brain because, of course, if it looks like an organ, it must be good for it. Together, they made a tonic believed to sharpen the thought, strengthen the chest, and ward off seasonal illness. Historians still argue whether the effect came from actual antibacterial properties or pure coincidence. You raise the cup to your lips. The taste is intense, first sour, then tannic, with a slightly smoky finish. It's not unpleasant, but you can see how it would be an acquired habit. A warm feeling creeps into your chest, part placebo, part vinegar burn. The tonic wasn't just a household remedy. It was also a travel companion. Merchants on long journeys carried small flasks to sip when passing through marshlands or crowded towns, where disease was thought to lurk in the very air. Monks might brew it in the summer and store it for winter, doling out spoonfuls to the sick or those who'd been out in the cold too long. In wealthier homes, it might be served in silver cups, the surface glinting as the dark liquid swirled inside. There's also a quirky superstition. You overhear from a passing washerwoman, drinking pickled walnut tonic on the morning of a storm will keep you from sneezing all day. No one can tell you why, but the confidence in her voice makes it sound almost worth testing. Some healers would enhance the tonic with spices, ginger, cloves, even a little honey to make it more palatable. Others insisted it had to be taken straight, like a soldier. Recipes varied wildly. In some, the walnuts soaked for 40 days. In others, they rested a full year before bottling. The older the brew, the stronger its reputation. Of course, it wasn't without warnings. Too much, and some believed it could heat the brain and cause sleeplessness. A few more cautious physicians recommended it only during certain seasons, spring and autumn, when the body was thought to be in a natural state of transition. But for those who swore by it, the tonic was part of daily life, as routine as lighting the morning fire. You sip again, this time letting the flavor linger. The temp settles into something woody and almost sweet at the back of your tongue. Maybe it's just your imagination, but your chest feels clearer, your breath somehow fresher. Against the cold air, the merchant sees your expression and nods knowingly, as though he's just handed you not a drink, but a shield against the world's unseen dangers. You hand the cup back, feeling oddly fortified, and tuck the memory away. Another strange medieval health ritual to add to your growing collection, one that clings to your senses long after you step back into the bustling street. The street opens into a quieter stretch of town, where the houses huddle low against the wind and the air smells faintly of wet straw. You hear the sound before you see it, a soft, irregular bubbling coming from a black iron cauldron hanging over a small fire. An elderly man, his hands knotted with age, is crouched beside it, stirring slowly. What's inside is a pale, thin broth with flecks of something darker drifting at the surface. He tells you, with the gravity of a priest announcing Mass, that this is boiled hedgehog broth. You glance at him, unsure if he's joking. He is not. The hedgehog has been skinned, its small frame simmered for hours with herbs and onion. The spines are gone, but the faint earthy aroma still carries a wild, woody scent. In medieval herbal texts, hedgehog broth was praised as a remedy for bladder stones, problem that, without modern surgery, was as dreaded as it was common. The belief was that the hedgehog's diet of insects and herbs imbued its meat with properties that could crush the stone and smooth the passage of water through the body. It sounds absurd now, but the logic followed a familiar medieval pattern. If an animal could consume hard-shelled beetles and seeds without trouble, surely its essence could help a human body pass something equally stubborn. Historians still argue whether this was based on real recovery cases or simply hopeful. Observation. You kneel beside the fire as he ladles some into a wooden cup. The broth is thin and clear, with a faintly nutty aftertaste from the hedgehog's meat. It's not unpleasant, but it's far from hearty fare. You suspect the real healing power comes from the warmth itself, seeping into chilled bones. This dish was never common. Hedgehogs weren't exactly livestock, but in rural areas where they were plentiful, they sometimes ended up in the cooking pot. They might be baked in clay first, which, when cracked open, pulled away the spines with the hardened clay shell. In more refined preparations, the meat would be shredded and added back to the broth with parsley or sage. There's a fringe belief you overhear from the old man's wife: if a pregnant woman drinks hedgehog broth during the full moon, her child will be as strong in health as in wit. Whether that means cleverness or just stubbornness is unclear, of course. There were skeptics even in the Middle Ages. Some physicians warned that hedgehog meat was too dry in humorous terms, potentially worsening certain ailments. Others objected on moral grounds. Hedgehogs were considered harmless garden creatures, and killing them for soup seemed excessive, unless sickness truly demanded it. But in places where remedies were few, the broth became a kind of hopeful last resort. Monks occasionally noted it in their infirmary records, usually alongside other drastic measures for kidney or bladder ailments. And, in the colder months, a pot of hedgehog broth simmering in a cottage might draw in curious neighbors, half for the warmth, half for the whispered promise of its effects. You sip again, the steam curling against your face. The flavor deepens the longer it lingers, almost like a cross between rabbit and dark chicken. It's oddly comforting, even if you're not convinced it's dissolving any invisible stones. The old man nods approvingly, as if you've joined some small, secret brotherhood of those who've tasted his unusual cure. When you hand the cup back, he wraps his shawl tighter and leans in to tell you one last thing. Best taken before sunrise. So the day's work begins with a clear stream. You smile politely, thank him, and continue on your way, silently adding hedgehog broth at dawn to the growing list of strange medieval self-care routines you never expected to try. By late afternoon, the smell of baking wafts through the street's warm crust, butter, and something rich beneath it. You follow it to a long trestle table set outside a cookshop, where a man in a flour-dusted apron is pulling a golden, steaming pie from a brick oven. He cracks the pastry open with a knife, and the scent changes less like bread, more like the river. He beams and announces it proudly: lamprey pie. You've heard of lampreys, those ill-like creatures with tooth-ringed mouths that look like something out of a nightmare. Yet here, they're not a horror, they're a delicacy. In medieval thought, lamprey meat wasn't just fine eating, it was medicinal. Their slippery, oily flesh was believed to lubricate the inner channels of the body, easing digestion, and even calming the temper. If eel jelly was for joints, lamprey pie was for your entire insides. The pie crust is thick and buttery, meant to seal in the rich juices during baking. Inside, chunks of lamprey are nestled with onions, spices, and sometimes wine or vinegar to cut the richness. The meat is darker than fish, firmer, almost like game, but with that unmistakable, slippery quality. Historians still argue whether the health claims were anything more than an excuse for nobles to gorge themselves. On an expensive dish, you're offered a slice on a wooden plate. The pastry flakes at the touch, and the filling glistens with dark, savory gravy. The first bite is intensely, in a way that coats your mouth with a deep, almost earthy flavor. It's not a subtle dish, but you can see why the wealthy prized it. It feels indulgent, the kind of food you imagine only a well-stocked kitchen could afford to prepare. Lampreys were so popular among the upper classes that they became a gift food. A noble might send a lamprey pie to another household as a sign of respect or political alliance. Monks recorded entire feast days where lamprey was the centerpiece, especially during Lent when fish was permitted but meat was not. In those weeks, lamprey, despite its odd looks, was elevated to the height of luxury. There's a quirky, half-serious superstition you overhear from the pie maker. Eating lamprey during the first thaw of spring ensures a smooth year with no quarrels in the household. He says it with a wink, as though the idea is half joke, half truth. Preparation was not for the faint of heart. Raw lamprey could be toxic if handled incorrectly, so cooks were meticulous, sometimes boiling them alive in spiced wine, other times blanching them before baking. The care taken was as much about health as flavor. One bad lamprey could ruin a feast and a reputation. Still, the medical claims persisted. Some physicians argued that lamprey's rich oils fed the brain and warmed the stomach. Others recommended it for those recovering from wasting illnesses. And in certain courts, it was whispered that lamprey kept the skin supple. And other reason the nobility embraced it. You finish your slice and wipe your fingers, feeling the lingering slickness of the meat even through the pastry. It's heavy fare, the kind that makes you want to sit down and digest in peace. But you can't deny the appeal. There's something almost ceremonial about eating a food so specific, so tied to its reputation, that it feels like you've participated in a quiet rite of status. As you step away, the pie maker calls after you, "Remember, enough lamprey, and you'll never creak when you bend." You laugh, half from the joke, half from the thought that maybe, just maybe, medieval self-care wasn't about moderation at all. It was about leaning into the richest, strangest thing you could find and calling it medicine. The sky is starting to dim when you pass through the gates of a quieter courtyard, where a servant is carrying a jug of something pale and smooth into a stone hall. The liquid sloshes thickly, cream-colored but not quite dairy. She catches your curious glance and smiles. Knowingly, it's almond milk, she says, made fresh that afternoon in your modern mind. Almond milk might seem like a plant-based alternative, but in the Middle Ages, it was a status symbol. Almonds were imported, costly, and in colder climates, exotic. Turning them into milk wasn't about avoiding dairy, it was about refinement, wealth, and, in the medical view, cooling the overheated stomach after a heavy feast. Rich nobles might sip it in the evening the way you might drink chamomile tea, trusting that it would soothe their insides and settle their humors. The preparation is laborious. Almonds are blanched, pounded in a mortar until they form a paste, then mixed with warm water or broth and strained through fine cloth. The resulting liquid is silky, faintly sweet, and perfumed with a nut's delicate aroma. In wealthier kitchens, cooks might add rosewater, honey, or a pinch of sugar if they could afford it. Historians still argue whether it was truly believed to heal or whether it was simply too pleasant not to prescribe. A steward pours some into a tall silver goblet and hands it to you. The first sip is smooth and mild, the flavor lingering softly at the back of your tongue. It's refreshing, especially after the heavier, oilier dishes you've endured today. You can see why it was recommended after banquet courses of roasted meat and spiced pies. It cleans the palate and feels almost cleansing to the stomach. In medical texts, almond milk was often listed as a gentle food for the sick, especially those who couldn't handle meat or strong spices. It was thought to cool the heat in the belly and sweeten the breath. Monks, who observed strict fasting rules, relied on it during meatless days, pouring it over grain porridge or using it to make custards without dairy. One quirky belief tied to almond milk was that it could keep skin pale and unblemished, which, in noble circles, was considered a sign of beauty and good health. Ladies might drink it regularly in the weeks before an important gathering, hoping to appear calm, cool, and luminous under candlelight. The drink wasn't without critics. Some healers warned it was too moist and could cause sluggishness if overused. Others argued that the imported almonds were often stale by the time they reached northern kitchens, lessening their supposed benefits. Still, the prestige of serving almond milk was undeniable. It was the sort of drink that signaled you had the money and the staff to grind nuts into liquid just for a moment's refreshment. You linger for a moment in the hall, sipping from the goblet, the sound of lute strings drifting in from somewhere. Deeper inside, servants pass, carrying platters of pears and figs, some destined to be eaten with the last of the almond milk as a sweet end to the evening meal. You can almost picture a noble leaning back in his chair, patting his stomach, declaring himself healed by the cooling draught, before reaching for a second goblet. When you finally hand back the cup, your mouth feels clean, your stomach oddly light. You realize that in a day full of strong flavors, this has been the gentlest, the most quietly luxurious, and in a world where healthy is often tangled with impressive, almond milk might be the most elegant medicine you've yet tasted. Evening air is damp now, carrying the smell of embers and wet straw, and you find yourself in a small, shadowed alley behind a tavern. A faint, sour aroma makes your nose wrinkle its, coming from a low wooden barrel, slightly cracked at the edges. A thin, wiry man lifts the lid, revealing a dense, yellowish liquid dotted with bubbles. He grins and offers you a cup. Fermented fish sauce, he says cheerfully. Your stomach hesitates. Fermented fish was a staple of medieval nutrition, particularly in coastal regions and monastic kitchens where fresh meat might be scarce. It was called garum or liquamon, depending on the recipe, and despite the pungent smell, it was prized for its flavor and perceived health benefits. The idea was that a small amount could strengthen digestion and balance humors, particularly if your constitution leaned to cold or wet. Historians still argue whether the health benefits were real, or if people mostly endured the smell because it made bland food taste lively. The man ladles a small quantity into a wooden cup. You lift it cautiously, bracing for the taste. The first sip hits like the sea itself, salty, briny, tangy, with a sharp tense that curls your nose hairs. It's not delicious in the modern sense, but it awakens something primal in your mouth. A rush of umami that turns any bland porridge or stew into a feast. Garum was not just for peasants. Nobles often imported barrels from the coasts of Spain, Italy, or North Africa, sometimes aging it for months to intensify the flavor. Recipes could include herbs, wine, or even blood to create subtle variations. Some wealthy kitchens had entire cupboards dedicated to different batches, each labeled with the expected strength and purpose. There's a quirky old belief you overhear: drinking garum with a pinch of sugar before sunrise allegedly made one resistant to colds for the entire winter. It sounds like something you'd scroll past on a dubious wellness blog today, yet it was repeated in household manuals. Monks sometimes recommended it too, arguing that a small spoonful could fire up the inner warmth, particularly helpful. In damp, draughty cloisters, preparation required patience. Fish had to be cleaned, salted, and left to ferment in the sun for weeks. Barrels were monitored carefully to prevent spoilage, and any batch that grew too strong or foul-smelling was discarded. In more desperate circumstances, used as fertilizer. Fringe recipes even called for mixing different species together: mackerel, anchovies, and occasionally lampreys. You remember that lamprey pie earlier and shudders slightly at the idea of combining them all. Despite its intensity, garum was versatile. A few drops could season a hearty stew, thicken a gravy, or even substitute for salt when it was scarce. Some cooks insisted on applying it to bread dough to enhance both taste and preservation, a practice that might horrify modern bakers but was entirely normal back then. You tip the last of your cup to the sky. The smell lingers on your fingers. And in your hair, a sharp reminder that medieval health sometimes demanded daring, or at least tolerance for extremely pungent liquids. Yet there's a strange satisfaction in knowing that something so salt, sun, and fish could carry the weight of both flavor and medicine, threading the line between nourishment, ritual, and curiosity. As you move away, the man calls. After you, drink small, think big. You chuckle, marveling at the audacity of medieval remedies, and step back into the twilight, your senses tingling from the sharp, strange taste that feels like a memory of the sea itself. Night has settled, and the castle corridors you wander are lit by flickering torches that throw long, dancing shadows across cold stone walls. In one quiet chamber, a small cauldron simmers over a low fire, releasing a fragrance that's somewhere between sweet and medicinal. A matronly woman stirs it with a wooden spoon and looks up at you with a mischievous smile. Cloves and wine for the cough, she murmurs, and a hint of crushed mice for stamina. If you dare, you blink. Crushed mice? Somehow it doesn't sound like the refined health drink you imagined. But in medieval medicine, nearly anything could be medicinal if it addressed the right humor imbalance. Mice were thought to invigorate the body and restore energy, particularly in cases of weakness or chronic illness. Historians still argue whether such remedies were actually therapeutic or simply a reflection of desperation when conventional ingredients weren't enough. You watch as she strains the mixture into a small cup. The liquid glimmers, rich and dark, smelling sharply of cloves and wine, the mouse powder hidden beneath the aroma. With a mix of apprehension and curiosity, you sip. The wine is warming, the cloves tickle your tongue and nose, and a peculiar earthy undertone sneaks in, subtle but unmistakably there. Your stomach protests slightly, but you feel oddly alert, like some ancient alchemy has sparked inside you. Cloves themselves were considered almost magical, imported from distant lands. They were expensive and prized, not just for flavor, but for their hot qualities in balancing cold or phlegmatic humors. Combined with wine, sugar, and sometimes honey, they could make a drink both medicinal and indulgent. Adding crushed mice, that was an eccentric flourish for those willing to test the limits of both taste and courage. You notice a tray of other curiosities on a side table: dried toads, powdered unicorn horn substitutes, usually coral or fossilized bone, and pouches of rare herbs. All were marketed as remedies for everything from digestive complaints to melancholy. The woman explains that a well-stocked castle pharmacy was essential, sometimes even more important than a cook. Nobles often relied on these strange concoctions for everyday wellness, while common folk made do with simpler, albeit still odd, herbal brews. It's striking how practical and ceremonial these drinks were at once. Sipping the mouse and clove tonic is not just ingestion. It's an act of belief, a ritual, a small commitment to the idea that health is cultivated through attentiveness, daring, and sometimes absurd ingredients. You remember almond milk, lamprey pie, garum each, odd in its own way, yet all tied to a sense of controlled, deliberate self-care. The woman smiles knowingly as you hand back the cup, muttering, "Courage makes a strong body," just as much as any potion. You laugh softly, imagining nobles sipping their odd tonics in ornate goblets, while courtiers whisper about the latest exotic remedy, even if it's unlikely to heal everything. You can't deny that there's power in participation, in tasting strangeness, in trusting tradition, and in embracing the bizarre logic of medieval health. By the time you leave, the cauldron's steam has coated the room with a spicy warmth, and the odd flavors linger in your memory. You realize that medieval wellness was as much about imagination and ritual as it was about the body itself, and sometimes the willingness to swallow the unexpected. A faint moonlight washes over the cobblestones as you wander toward the outer gardens, where the scent of herbs mingles with damp earth. A small wooden table holds dozens of jars, each labeled with careful script that speaks of a curious mixture of caution and promise. A gardener leans over, pulling out a jar filled with a thick, dark paste. Beetroot preserves, he says, but mixed with powdered snail shells for iron. Very good for the blood, they claim. Beetroot was prized for its red color and believed medicinal powers, associated with strength and vitality, while powdered snail shells were thought to provide mineral reinforcement. The combination seems unusual, but in medieval dietary theory, it makes sense. Visual and conceptual resemblance often guided medicine. Red foods were assumed to benefit the blood, and crunchy shells, why not? Historians still argue whether these color-based remedies actually influenced health or were primarily symbolic. You scoop a small portion onto your finger and taste. Earthy sweetness with a faint chalky bite reaches your tongue. Oddly satisfying, though you suppress a grimace at the gritty texture. Still, it's not unpleasant, and you can see why it would be prescribed to those who are weak, pale, or recovering from illness. In an age without iron supplements, snail shell powder was a clever, if unpalatable, approach to fortifying the diet. Nearby, you spot a tray of strange sweetmeats, sugared violets, candied rose petals, and honeyed marzipan molded into miniature animals. They weren't just treats, they were also considered medicinal. Sugar was warming and believed to strengthen internal humors, while herbs infused in sweets could deliver subtle remedies without the bitterness of raw powders. A curious blend of delight and purpose, the medieval palate blurred the line between indulgence and treatment. You notice one quirky local belief: eating roasted snails was thought to calm fever and balance the heart. The idea that slimy, slow-moving creatures could somehow restore vitality seems absurd, yet it fits neatly with the medieval worldview, where every ingredient had a moral and physical correspondence. Courtiers might have scoffed at peasants consuming snail paste, but in the physician's eyes, both were on the path to better health. As you wander the garden further, herbs brush against your arm: sage, rosemary, and thyme, each with its own assigned benefits. Sage for memory, rosemary for circulation, thyme for respiratory wellness. You inhale deeply, imagining how medieval cooks and apothecaries would grind, infuse, and combine these fragrant leaves into tonics, poultices, and food. The line between kitchen and clinic is nearly invisible here. You pause near a fountain, watching moonlight ripple over the water. Beetroot paste in hand, the fragrant herbs around you, and the distant smell of honeyed flowers combine into a sensory snapshot of medieval wellness. It's an ecosystem of belief and experimentation where taste, sight, and ritual intertwine. Odd, sometimes unpalatable, occasionally bizarre, undeniably alive. You realize that health in this world was never merely biological. It was social, aesthetic, and psychological, a layered understanding that demanded both curiosity and courage. The castle kitchens are quieter now, the clatter of pots long faded, leaving only the rhythmic drip of water from the stone fountain. In the courtyard, a lone cook moves among the shadows, setting out bowls of what looks like a dark, lumpy porridge. He waves you over. Chickpeas and mustard seed, he says, but with a touch of powdered human skull. Strengthens the brain, or so they say. You freeze, half in disbelief, half in fascination. Medicinal powders derived from human bones were a grim yet surprisingly common part of late medieval pharmacology. The idea, rooted in sympathetic magic, was that consuming small quantities of the body carefully prepared and powdered could transfer its strength, wisdom, or vitality to the living. Historians still argue whether this practice was symbolic, psychological, or truly intended for physiological effect. You scoop a tiny portion, noting its gritty texture and earthy smell. The mustard seed bites, a tangy reminder that flavor often disguised the bizarre additives. Surprisingly, the porridge itself is hearty and nourishing, warming you from the inside. You remind yourself that many of these strange ingredients were used sparingly, often mixed with more conventional foods to make them tolerably and sometimes to make the act of consumption feel like a ritual rather than a punishment. Nearby, jars line the walls with other curious powders, burnt animal horns, dried lizard flesh, and crushed pearls. Each had its own assigned benefit. Pearls, for example, were believed to calm the stomach and eyes, and powdered lizard to balance cold humors. A quirky side note: in some texts, the skull powders were thought particularly effective if sourced from those who died young, under the belief that youth preserves strength. Modern readers can't help but shiver at that notion. You notice the cook humming softly as he prepares the next batch, a ritualistic tune that seems almost as important as the ingredients themselves. In medieval kitchens, the act of preparation, mixing, and chanting was part of the remedy. It reinforced faith in the medicine, and in a world with limited clinical tools, belief often influenced outcomes as much as any physical effect. As you stir the porridge, you recall the fermented fish, lamprey pies, and crushed mice tonics of earlier sections. Each seemed more outrageous than the last, yet all shared a common logic: the blending of symbolism, available materials, and the hope that ingestion could affect the inner body. Odd combinations, strong smells, and bizarre powders were not just tolerated, they were expected. Finally, you take a slow breath, letting the aroma of mustard, chickpeas, and something unnameable wash over you. In the quiet kitchen, it becomes clear that medieval health practices were an immersive sensory world: taste, smell, sight, and belief all entwined. You sip the porridge again, grimace slightly, and marvel at the courage people once needed simply to nourish themselves, to attempt to heal. Outside, the moon has climbed higher, casting silvery light across the castle's vegetable gardens. You step lightly among the neat rows of herbs and roots, the air thick with the mingled scents of soil, rosemary, and a hint of lingering smoke. From the kitchens, a gardener crouches near a patch of garlic, speaking conspiratorially. "Garlic," he says, "good for your heart, your head, your stomach, even wards off evil spirits. But mix it with crushed wasp wings, and you'll be protected from fever too." You raise an eyebrow. Crushed wasp wings. Somehow, the medieval imagination never seems to take a day off. Garlic itself is historically well documented, praised for both its flavor and medicinal qualities, from cardiovascular support to antimicrobial effects. Adding powdered insects, that's a fringe practice, often recommended in small doses as part of alchemical remedies. Historians still argue whether these insect-based prescriptions had any measurable effect, or if they were simply intended to demonstrate the apothecaries' mastery of rare ingredients. Curiosity trumps caution. You pick up a small spoonful of the garlic paste laced with the mysterious wings. It tastes sharp, pungent, and surprisingly fiery. You gag slightly at the faint, metallic aftertaste, but keep it down. The ritual is important here. You're not just consuming an ingredient or participating in centuries of belief, tradition, and sensory storytelling. Nearby, a collection of dried flowers and herbs is arranged carefully on a wooden bench. Lavender for sleep, thyme for breath, and rose petals for the heart. Their presence is almost decorative, yet each was meant to deliver subtle healing through both aroma and ingestion. Medieval people believed the senses could guide the humors, and smelling or tasting the right combination was as important as any potion or powder. You notice the curious practice of blending unlikely foods for combined effect. Honeyed wine with powdered peacock's tongue, oat porridge with powdered beetles, even toasted earthworms mixed into broths for stamina. The logic is surprisingly consistent. One ingredient to stimulate, another to soothe, a third to symbolically transmit strength or balance. Even the most bizarre mixtures had a careful rationale, though by modern standards it might seem more theatrical than scientific. As you wander further, the castle walls loom around you, ancient stones humming with the echoes of cooks, apothecaries, and anxious patience. You pause to breathe in the garden air, tasting lingering hints of garlic, herbs, and earth. Each odd combination, from crushed mice to powdered bones, roasted snails to insect-laced tonics, feels less like a threat and more like a story. A tactile connection to a worldview where health, ritual, and imagination were inseparable. You run your fingers along the cold stone and think back to the strange foods you've sampled tonight. The fermented, the spiced, the powdered, the outright terrifying, they're all threads in the same tapestry. Odd, yes, but deeply human in their creativity, resourcefulness, and desire to control the unpredictable body. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson, even when the methods seem absurd. The intention was universal, seeking balance, vitality, and a little reassurance in an uncertain world. The castle corridors are hushed now, the only sounds your own footsteps echoing softly against the stone. You carry a small satchel of the night's oddities, jars of beetroot paste, mustard-laced chickpea porridge, a few candied petals, and a tiny vial of powdered snail shells. Each seems heavier in your hands than it did in the kitchen, weighted with centuries of belief, ritual, and human imagination. You wonder how anyone could have survived or thrived. On such a diet, your mind drifts back to the countless strange meals and remedies you've encountered tonight. Fermented fish that could knock out a horse, roasted mice claimed to restore vigor, and the subtle, almost ceremonial use of herbs for every imaginable ailment. In some ways, it feels like a world apart from your modern life, yet also surprisingly familiar. We still search for superfoods, miracle elixirs, and wellness hacks, just with less crushed bones and more kale smoothies. Historians still argue whether medieval practices were dangerously misguided or simply the best tools. Available for a time without microscopes and vitamins, you pause at a quiet nook where moonlight filters through a narrow window, casting a gentle glow on the ancient mortar and pestle left behind by the apothecary. You imagine countless hands grinding powders, stirring mixtures, whispering incantations or prayers as each dose is prepared. There is something almost tender about it, a dedication to care, to attempting mastery over illness. However eccentric the methods might appear today, you unwrap a small portion of honeyed rose-petal candy, savoring the subtle floral sweetness. The flavor is comforting, delicate, and a little magical. You think of the lavish banquets, the humble kitchens, the apothecaries, and the garden herbs, all woven into a single, strange, and sensory tapestry. In this world, taste, sight, and smell were inseparable from healing. The oddities were not mistakes, but an expression of creativity, courage, and hope. As your steps carry you back toward the main hall, you reflect on the journey through centuries of strange but earnest attempts at wellness. Each bite, each powder, each ritual was part of a broader understanding. The body is fragile, life is uncertain, and imagination can be as powerful as any medicine. Even when bizarre, the effort mattered, an intimate dance between humans and the unknown. You settle by a window, gazing at the pale moon over the castle battlements. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of herbs and damp stone. The odd foods, the uncanny remedies, the rituals of taste and smell, they all begin to blur together, forming a gentle rhythm. It's a world of color, aroma, and texture that lingers just beneath the skin, inviting reflection. You realize that, for all its eccentricity, there is a warmth in it, a deep, human striving for comfort, vitality, and reassurance in the midst of uncertainty. You let yourself exhale, slow your heartbeat, and imagine the faint echoes of distant kitchens and gardens fading with the moonlight. Oddities and all, there is a tender rhythm to the past, and tonight you've been a quiet witness. The night grows softer, shadows stretch long and thin along the castle walls, and a gentle breeze drifts through the open window, carrying the faintest traces of herbs, honey, and damp stone. You feel the weight of the evening settling into your chest, the strange smells and textures blending into memory. Everything seems quieter now, as if the walls themselves are breathing with you, holding stories of long-past kitchens, gardens, and apothecaries. You imagine the medieval cooks and apothecaries moving slowly through candlelit halls, each gesture deliberate, each mixture prepared with care and hope. Even the oddest ingredients, the powdered bones, crushed insects, or roasted maize, become part of a rhythm, a ritual, a gentle insistence that someone, somewhere, is looking after the body and the spirit. However unconventional their methods might appear, the night air cools your skin, carrying a soothing promise. You allow the oddities of the evening to fade into soft curiosity rather than shock. The sense of the garden, the lingering flavors, and the memory of candlelight merge into a dreamlike hum. You can almost hear the faint scratching of herbs being ground, the soft murmur of instructions whispered to attentive apprentices. The distant clink of jars. Slowly, your mind begins to drift. The peculiar remedies, the bizarre foods, the curious human inventiveness, they all settle into a gentle narrative, a story of people seeking balance, comfort, and reassurance in the only ways they knew. It's not about fear or disgust. It's about curiosity, imagination, and the delicate, strange, and beautiful ways humans try to care for themselves and one another. Now, your body relaxes, your thoughts soften, and the world of medieval wellness, with all its quirks and wonders, lulls you toward rest. You are carried gently, safely, into a quiet, restorative calm.